Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we're going to be reading true, creepy neighbor horror stories. I hope you enjoy them. So, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. I've shared a not as creepy event that's happened to me, but this particular occurrence never put me in any jeopardy. It was more my neighbors, but creepy nonetheless. Keep in mind that I am unsure of the exact age that I was during this series of events, but it took place over a majority of my life thus far, and promptly ended in 2011 when I was about 11. I remember most of these things happening, and my mom has filled me in on some of the details since. I'm not sure if it belongs here, but I really don't ever want to meet this person again. I live in a good neighborhood, in a good city. It was being built when we moved there. But I always remember these two being my neighbors. Their names were Betty and Jeff. The first interaction that I remember having with either of them was when Betty gave my sister and I a whole bunch of McDonald's toys. You know how they display every one of the toys inside? We got one of those displays. I was 5 and my sister was 2, and I remember being ecstatic as any younger child would be. My mom later informed me that Betty would tell her that we were the cutest kids in the world, and that she wished she had children like us. Flash forward a few years later, where I'm guessing that I was about 7 or 8. I was hanging out with another girl my age, and was also my neighbor down the street. We left my house, and we were walking to hers. When we got outside, we saw Betty throwing a bunch of Jeff's stuff out of the second-story window. I vividly remember her screaming profanities as she tossed an old TV set out the window, and smelling cologne that she must have thrown out the window as well. My friend and I rushed to get inside, and we just thought that she was crazy. Between the ages of 8 and 10, Betty and Jeff must have had a few more fights. There's nothing that I can remember, but I do remember my mother telling me that Betty confronted my dad. My dad had been outside doing yard work at about 8:30 or 9 p.m. It was summertime, so the sun was still out and the kids were still outside yelling and playing. All of a sudden, Betty marched out of her house and straight to my dad. She yelled at him for keeping everyone awake with the sound of a leaf blower, and probably called him an MFer a few times. I would understand her anger more if it was dark out, but it still kind of confuses me. Maybe she had a right to be angry. One day when I was 10, I had returned home from school to the sight of police cars and a bunch of yellow caution tape surrounding Betty and Jeff's house. I ran inside and asked my mom what had happened, but she had no clue. She later found out from my other neighbor that Betty had died, possibly by being thrown down the stairs or something like that. They were trying to figure out if it was self-inflicted, or if Jeff had finally lost his stuff and killed her. A few days later, I was outside by myself drawing with chalk. As soon as I got outside, I saw Jeff walk over to his glass door. He hadn't been arrested for anything yet, and was still presumed innocent. I thought I had nothing to worry about, so I continued on and retrieved my chalk from the garage. I began to draw when I noticed that Jeff was staring out his door and staring directly at me. This continued for 10 minutes. I eventually got creeped out and went to tell my dad. By the time he came outside with me, Jeff had left the door. That's when I realized that maybe Jeff was the crazy one. In April of 2011, Jeff was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 30 years. He gave Betty a fatal dose of antifreeze, and I'm still unsure of whether he actually pushed her drugged and dead body down the stairs for good measure. After reading an article on it, Betty claimed that Jeff was very abusive and would not let her do anything without his permission. That would explain her behavior, but I'm still not completely convinced that she was entirely innocent either. A new couple has since moved into their house. They're completely normal from what I can tell. Knock on wood. And we haven't had any murderous events happen on my street since. This happened a little bit ago, about a month, and it was a bizarre experience to say the least. I'm 15, and I was playing some video games before passing out. It was about, say, 11 p.m. when I hear the doorbell ring. Out of instinct, I begin walking downstairs, but about halfway there, rationality came to mind. Who the heck rings a doorbell at 11 p.m.? I silently strode back upstairs and stood in the hall, kinda expecting something bad to happen. Exactly 1 minute later, it rings twice. My parents begin to leave their room and give me a quizzical look, and all I had to respond with was a shrug. Then he starts banging on the door. My mother jumps at the first bang, and my father's eyes widened, but more in confusion than fear. He decided to go downstairs and peep through the view hole. It was our neighbor. My dad hesitantly opened the door, and I could hear my father's voice tremble slightly. Hey, what do you need? Next thing I hear is an entire full-blown scream argument from our neighbor, claiming that this household was his and we stole it from him. My father's uneasiness was quickly replaced with annoyance, and he simply shut the door without giving our neighbor the time of day. My dad stepped on the first step going up the stairwell when our neighbor first hit the door. I'm not talking banging with a fist. This man was full-on body slamming it. My father was stunned for a second, and my neighbor charged the door again. This time we began to hear the splintering of wood. Everyone reacted at once. My father went to brace the door with his body. My mother went to go get the other two kids, and I went for 911. The body slamming ensued for another 5 minutes, and while I was on the phone with 911, it stopped. I thought it was over and I was relieved, but I still stuck on the phone. I go peek out the front window of my house, and boy was it only getting started. Our neighbor took his Jeep Wrangler and simply directed it straight at our house. We had zero clue what he was doing, until he hit the gas and we heard the squealing of tires. Then he immediately hit the brakes. He was trying to scare us out of the house. I was still on the phone with 911, and I stepped away from the window to comfort my siblings, crack jokes and such. Eventually, police arrived and arrested him. The next morning, I left for school, still shaken from the night before. I stepped onto our front steps and saw tire marks leading up to our front door. The lunatic actually nearly rammed our door down with his car. I really never want to see this guy ever again. But he lives directly to my right. Also, I don't know if he has a mental illness or not. I'm sorry. And no, I'm not going to physically harm him via blade or bullet, so stop suggesting that. I also don't care if he had threatened us. The situation was resolved with no one harmed. Stop saying that I or my father should have hurt anyone. There was no need. Rationality over emotion. And no, not even I trust my guardians with a firearm. I would probably be the best candidate for it, but I doubt my father will buy a gun and rely on his 15-year-old son to use it. Best that I wait until I'm of age. Hey everyone. This is a real story that has absolutely traumatized me and my boyfriend. 2 years ago, I moved to the UK for university, as I always wanted to go there and get away from my parents, as the situation at home was beginning to become a bit too toxic for me. In my first year at uni, I moved into a student accommodation and met some really great people. It was a good year without meeting my boyfriend, who I'm still with, and just enjoying my time away from my family and discovering what independence really meant. Anyhow, as second year came by, I decided with some friends to move into a house rented by student accommodations. But at least we had our own house and weren't restricted as much with noise and parties as living in a small shared flat like in the first year. Note, I had a ground floor room, and my window gave into a very small backyard in which I would go smoke every day as I'm a smoker, and in which there would be a very thin wooden door giving into the other side of the street, where you would put your bins and broken chairs, blah blah blah. The door could only be closed and locked from inside the backyard, but since it was an old door, we had to attach some strings to keep it closed for good. I had neighbors on each side of the house, so we were surrounded by families and some other student accommodations. The neighbors on the right of us were 5 boys, who looked way over the age of being in university. They were strange, so to say. I met one of them outside of our house one day because of a police intervention due to one of his flatmates attacking him, and the others with a kitchen knife, and burning their kitchen down. I heard some screams, and so I went outside with my flatmates, and saw one of them being covered in blood and cuts everywhere on his arm, and a wound on his head inflicted by a kitchen knife. Me and my flatmates didn't know what to do, so we offered him to help to clean himself, and to give him an old t-shirt to change out of his bloody clothes. We then saw the guy who hurt these flatmates being escorted out by the police and into a van and driven off to be arrested. I don't know anything more about the story. The police didn't really tell us anything else. Anyway, the guy who we helped was quite weird. He said a lot of stuff and kept trying to grab me and flirt with me. And we noticed when helping him he smoked quite a lot of marijuana, but just didn't really care at the moment, as we just wanted to make sure that he was okay, as we didn't know him. Then, after some time had passed, I would go to uni and come back home and see him quite often in the street, and just never said a word to him again. But one day, he came up to me in the street while I went to the corner shop, and started talking to me weirdly, and I didn't feel comfortable at all with that for some reason, so I just didn't respond to him. He then just said, "Oh, that's okay. I'll just wait in front of your house then, and we can talk further." Needless to say, I was creeped out, and just thought that he was joking. So I bought my drink at the shop and headed back to my street. And as I turned into the street where my house was, I saw him with his flatmate sitting on my doorstep and waiting for me. So I panicked and went back next to the corner shop, and called my only guy flatmate to ask him to open the door and tell the guys to go away. But obviously he wasn't home and no one else was either. So I literally just waited it out until they left an hour later, and then sprinted back home and locked the front door. Note, my front door had a glass panel on it where you would be able to kind of make out who was standing in front of it. After this already pretty scary encounter, I just tried to avoid the guy, and mostly succeeded for a while. But then one day, as I went smoking in the backyard, I noticed that the wooden door, which is always closed, was open, and the strings that we put there to keep it closed were cut off. For whatever reason, I didn't think anything of it, and just closed the door again and put a new string on it, thinking that it was one of my flatmates who took the bins out and just didn't tie it back. The weird neighbors would often scream and yell and fight in their house, and it would wake me and my flatmates up in the middle of the night. But we kind of got used to it after a while. But one evening, my boyfriend slept over like he usually did, and he, who usually never wakes up because of noise, woke up in the middle of the night because of a bang and some whispering. I was sound asleep, so he very silently woke me up, and we both just waited in the dark and listened for any other noises. Suddenly, we heard the wooden door just bang, just shot open, and some footsteps next to my window. I always had my window open because it would get really warm inside. So we both just froze. and then we heard the door leading to the backyard get shaken softly, as if they were trying to get inside. And then they stopped. Luckily, we had the curtains closed, so they couldn't see us. But we were ready to get dressed and get out of the room and lock them in if they came in from the window. Then we just heard the window move and get more open, and one of the guys saying something in a different language that we didn't understand. And then we started to hear them trying to get in. My boyfriend and I just shot up out of the bed, took my phone, put on clothes, and ran out of the room and out of the house. I then called my flatmates and told them to lock themselves in their rooms, and then I called the police, who luckily came in less than 5 minutes, as the headquarters were only a couple streets down from us. I don't remember anything after the police came. I think that me and my boyfriend were in shock. They ended up catching one guy. The other fled and was later found a few streets up smoking weed. The police told us that they went inside of the house and found a lot of meth and heroin, and that they were just carrying a massive kitchen knife with them. I was so confused, as I've never done anything to offend or do anything wrong to my neighbors. So the idea of them breaking in with God knows what intentions with a kitchen knife terrorized me and my boyfriend. The 2 guys ended up being arrested, and one of them was put in prison for 2 years for carrying a weapon with intention to harm. I never heard anything else from the police, and I moved back home a few months later, as I was so scared and it tormented me for months on end, not knowing what would have happened if my boyfriend didn't wake up. I'm now still coping with it, and I find it really tough to get over it. I'm always asking myself what if, and what would have happened. I now very often wake up because of the slightest noise, and I get horrible nightmares because of it. But hey, at least I'm still with my boyfriend, and we often talk about it, and it helps a lot. I am omitting identifying details for privacy's sake. If your world absolutely cannot go on without them, then I guess feel free to DM me. You've got a 50-50 shot of me answering or me telling you to leave me alone. But let's take it back to 2007 to 2008. I was 16 when this began, 18 or 19 when it finally went to court. Picture a Norman Rockwell-esque suburban family. Parents, 3 kids, a yard and a dog, and blink and you'll miss it, USA. One random day, a neighbor man has a mild dispute with his neighbor. As a totally warranted response, neighbor man takes every hose that he has and floods their yard. Solid decisions lead to solid consequences, so naturally he was fined for water waste. My parent runs the water in small-town USA, and because neighbor man lived a block from us, he decided to drive over to the water district, shouting that he is an acquaintance of my parent. Second solid decision of many to come from neighbor man. Absolutely no one takes kindly to name dropper folks, so tuck that gem away under life facts. My parent comes in and tells him that even if his kids did this, they would still have the same repercussions, gracefully glossing over the fact that, other than maybe driving by one another, none of us actually have ever interacted with neighbor man. Neighbor man repeats the name of the man working at the front desk, as well as my parents' name, and claims it's now personal, and storms out. My family members and I began to see neighbor man at random places constantly. The DMV, the grocery store, our respective jobs, etc. Apparently, when you're cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs and your parents pay for your house, you have all kinds of time to stalk. It went from random sightings while out and about to phone calls. The cliche 90s type of call, breathe, hang-ups, and the I can see you variety. At this point, neighbor man was more of an annoyance than scary. But as I've stated, when you underestimate crazy, you lose every time. Neighbor man began parking across from our house, staying from 6 p.m. to 4 a.m., literally just sitting in his car, blasting music, staring at the house. Fool must have had the determination and bladder of a racehorse, because who sits there for 10-ish hours? His music was trash too. Maybe he was a masochist, seeing how long that he could suffer through crappy music and a full bladder. I doubt that anyone with a semi-rational concept of social interaction could fathom why. This went on from 3 to 4 times a week to a nightly occurrence. Imagine being a 16-year-old female that doesn't even feel comfortable to change in her room because of the prospect that he might see through the blinds somehow. Trying to sleep knowing he's out there. We were prisoners in our own home. He began to get bolder. Neighbor man drove his car speeding and up onto the sidewalk at my sibling and her partner while they were on the sidewalk, out front coming home from a date. They both had to physically jump out of the way to avoid being hit. He made lewd gestures at me when I brought my dog out for a walk and was waiting for my sibling to come out and join us on the walk. It was so bad that I ended up crying and going back inside. This had been going on for a year at this point. The cops always said the same thing. There's nothing we can do unless there is a threat made against you or someone is harmed. My parent confronted, meaning tired of his crap and asking him what he thinks he's doing, neighbor man in the street after my incident, to which neighbor man called the cops, and they came asking us why we were harassing and threatening neighbor man. I will never understand why the system waits until you're a victim rather than prevents someone from being victimized. Almost 2 years in and it's Christmas time. My parent has a brain aneurysm. Fortunately, they made it through without any lingering effects, which is extremely rare. I convinced my other parent, who had been living at the hospital with their sick partner, to come home and shower and eat. At about 9 p.m., we get a knock at the door. A random man in random clothes, holding a Christmas present, says that he's here to deliver it to family name. We ask who sent him, and he says he can't say. We ask who he works for, and he shoves the gift at my parent and leaves. We were obviously very uncomfortable opening it. Parent decides that they need to know what it is and opens the present. Inside is a 17-page document of the grounds on why neighbor man is suing my parent that was currently in the hospital. Even I could tell that it was fake with the grammatical errors and typos. Neighbor man took the time to set and type this up himself, thinking that it would scare us. The document and fake details that he put in did not. The fact that this 40-something-year-old man was so fixated on our family that he sat and typed a 17-page fake document did scare us, however. Things progress, and neighbor man began pacing in front of his car and pretending to have phone calls, and where he talked about pushing my parent down the stairs, or knowing where the kids went to school and worked, and how easy it would be to access us at any time. At the time, I worked a closing shift, and it let me off at about 1 a.m. He would be parked next to my car and follow me home. One time, I even tried to take random roads, and he still stayed right behind me, pulling up to the house with neighbor man parked across the street. Think neighborhood street with maybe 5 feet between a car parked on one side and one on the other, and having to get out and run to the door was a nightmare. We were all exhausted from not only the aneurysm scare, but also living looking over our shoulders. My parents' friend told her friend, who is a DA, about the situation. She called and came over and took our case on pro bono. Testifying was a wild ride. We had to put in official statements prior to being called to the stand. We were not allowed to be in the room when a family member was testifying, nor were we allowed to talk in the halls as we waited for our turn. Imagine reliving 2+ years of traumatic experiences, being cross-examined where you're made out to be a liar, and then not able to have your family comfort or support you afterwards. Needless to say, it was not ideal. There was enough to put him away for a 1.5 years. as well as a grant of felony restraining order. We moved while he was still incarcerated. My sister passed while he was in prison, and he immediately tried to sue her estate. She was 21 at the time of her death. He tried to sue her after he was released. He claimed that her testimony from him running his car at her and her pretending was false, and the only reason he was locked up. That's not the case, as there were harassment and stalking charges, and that the money that people donated to a GoFundMe for her accident, he was entitled to. There's so many more details, but this was already long enough. So neighbor man, let's never meet again. You made us prisoners in our home for years, and clearly you are still the same and have not learned a thing from your time locked up. The dumbest part about all of this is it's not even the first creepy experience that I've had living in this apartment. Both floor units are giant suck. I live on the bottom floor in the back corner of an apartment building in a major city. One of my bedroom windows looks out into a ground level, inaccessible dirt alleyway between my building and the one next door. Well, a weird new guy moved into the next door building, and boy does he chain smoke his heart out. Oftentimes he smokes cigarettes and sits in his window, but sometimes we will climb out and stand in the alley. The first time I ever noticed him, it was well after nightfall when I was home alone. I saw an ember levitating in the darkness, and then it dawned on me. It's someone smoking. In the pitch dark. I promptly closed the shutters, but not before noticing that he was looking directly into my bedroom. Okay, I get it. I'm moving around and I caught his eye. No big deal. Over the next few months, my boyfriend or I would notice him occasionally. If you lay on my bed, you are at a low enough angle where you can see him when he's at the window through the cracks in the blinds. We noticed that he always seems to be looking in my window's general direction. Always. He doesn't just smoke a cigarette here and there. This dude will either sit in his window and chain smoke for an hour, or pop out several times at night. So it beckons the question, is he just looking in our general direction, or does he see us? I've been having some creepy things happening with a new neighbor in my apartment complex recently. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just overreacting, but I would love a second opinion. I'm a 24-year-old female college student living 2 blocks from school. I've lived in the same spot for 2 years, and I've never had any issues. I have a small emotional support dog that lives with me too. This will be important later. Things just got weird this last month. A guy moved into the apartment below me. His apartment is to the right of the only stairwell leading up to my house. I always have to walk by his door to walk to class, check my mail, or get into my car. To describe him, he honestly reminds me a lot of Norman Bates. Quiet, strange, small build, pale skin and bright blue eyes. Something about him just seems off. I first met him when I was trying to leave my apartment. I was about to back up when some jerk pulled his car, blocking me from exiting. I was getting out of my car to ask him to pull forward, when my new neighbor was also getting into his car. Instead of letting me speak to this guy, he told him to move and I politely said thank you and left. The next day, he was waiting outside by his bike to go to class. He instead follows me up the hill to make small talk. He asks me a lot of questions which made me feel a little interrogated. Some of the questions were like, where are you from? How old are you? Are you single? How long have you been here? 2 days later on a Saturday, he knocks on my door forcefully at 8 a.m. I jump up out of my sleep and look through the peephole to see him standing there rocking back and forth. Mind you, I've only seen him twice, and we've never had a real conversation other than him trying to pry into my life like he knows me. He knocks on my door 3 more times, and finally just slips something underneath it and leaves. I wait about 10 minutes and open the door to find a note. It said, "Hello there, neighbor. I just have a few questions about your dog. How do you get away with having her? I want to get one but don't know how. I'd love to hear more. Cheers and kindest regards, Jimmy. P.S. Here's my number. Please text me." I decided to not text him because I don't like telling every person about why I have my dog. It's no one's business but mine and my realtor's. I also was uncomfortable with the fact that he came to my door with no knowledge that I lived in that specific unit. That's when things started to happen. He waits till I leave for school and rides his bike behind me. 2 weeks ago, I had to make several trips to my car because I brought groceries, and he stood by his window and watched me the entire time. Every time I go outside now, he watches me with the blinds open. He knows that I've noticed him too, but he doesn't seem to care. He just stares with a blank, lustful, or sinister look in his eyes. Yesterday, I took my dog outside, and he came outside of his house and stood at the back of the building to watch us play in the grass. He just stared at me. When I wanted to come back inside, he just watched me walk upstairs and pass him while he just had a cold look on his face. I've never been a woman who scares easily. I can take care of my own. But he is making me feel very, very uneasy. I live in a very small town, about a population of 1,100 if not less. Word gets around fast about a lot of things. I got the heads up in October of 2013 that I would be having a new neighbor soon, and he just got out of prison for some sort of crime, as he'd been registering on the offenders list. As a single female who lives alone and has some serious traumas, this did not set well with me. But the guy was pretty well shrouded in mystery, save for hearsay. When the guy first moved in, I was probably his biggest advocate. I kept telling people to give him a chance, because we still didn't really know what he was in prison for. I mean, hey, guys get put on the offender list even for peeing outside sometimes, right? But they don't go to prison for it either. Nevertheless, I decided I would try to keep an open mind. I'm going to take a minute to explain the layout of my apartment. My main entrance is a hidden door. I have a small driveway next to it and a bunch of bushes. The neighbor's house is right next to my entrance, separated by the bushes, and his front door pretty much faces mine, though mine faces to the south, while his is a straight view of my front door. I went weeks creeping around my own apartment in an effort not to have my new neighbor, even though I kept telling people to give him a chance. Admittedly, I was pretty weirded out by the situation, until one day while I was trying to get back into my car to go to work, and suddenly the neighbor popped out from behind that row of bushes. It startled me to be sure, but he introduced himself, and I introduced myself. He offered to trim the bushes. I'm not even kidding. Admittedly, I didn't know whether to laugh or be weirded out, but I just told him that I only rent the apartment, and I wasn't sure what my landlords would want. Sometime between here and there, it came out that he was in prison for attempted assault, as well as a slew of assault and battery charges. The official story goes that he was at a bar with several of his friends, and there was a group of women drinking there too. One of the girls felt sick and wanted to lay down in a friend's car in the parking lot, and he followed her, and yeah, you can see where it's going from there. I did not necessarily feel very endearing to him upon hearing that. I also felt the need to mention that we live within the school district. Elementary, middle, and high school are literally just up the street, and lots of parents were in an uproar about him living there. though I believe our state law indicates that there's no problem with it as long as no crimes were committed against a child. His parents were here with him for a bit, but I got the very distinct and accurate feeling that they were going to get him established here and then dump him on the community at large. In early November, I had a car accident. The neighbor came into my workplace, literally a block away. It's a small town, like I said. He came that afternoon. It was my day off, and started to ask my boss about me, starting with if I worked there. He almost had to have known since I walked to work pretty frequently, and at that point I wasn't trying to hide it. I was there first. No reason to go out of my way yet to avoid him. She said that his eyes were all over the place, like he was casing the joint, and he was rather possessive in speech. My neighbor. I met her. Mine, me, mine, my. And asked if I'd been in a wreck. She confirmed, and he said that he'd have to bring me over a care package. That was the last thing that I wanted. The whole exchange left her with a rather sour feeling in her stomach, and she called me immediately to let me know what had just transpired. I'm still relieved to say that the care package never came, but it definitely put me on edge. Even more so when he came into my work that following Monday to get breakfast and told me that he didn't know that I worked there. All right, at that point in time, I was definitely sketched out. His parents left the day before Thanksgiving. Yep, they left their son all alone the day before Thanksgiving. While I don't really like the guy, I think that was pretty screwed up. Somewhere between this time period, I started noticing him watching me. Not too frequently when his parents were there, but just enough for me to notice that he was watching, and for my hackles to be raised. After his parents dumped him there, the watching became pretty constant, all the time. I would leave in the morning. He's at the front door watching. I would leave in the middle of the day, conveniently outside waving. Come home at night in the pitch darkness, still waiting and watching. Over the next month and a half, things really escalated on that front. I was feeling less and less safe about going home. Several friends and family members witnessed him watching me. He seemed to skulk around at weird times. On Thanksgiving Day, he hit all the houses of single women on the block and dropped off 3-pound bags of M&Ms for anyone. He tried to knock on my door, but I didn't answer, and I've pretty much stopped responding to door knocking that does not come with a phone call or text first. He went upstairs to my landlord's entrance, introduced himself, and asked that she make sure that I get some of the candy. Yeah, no thanks. I talked to a female police officer, the only one we have. Yeah, we are that much of a token community. And she told me to start logging everything, and that the police would do nightly checks on their ride-arounds. My landlord cleared out a space on the other side of the garage for me, so I no longer have to park around back. I can use the other set of stairs to get directly into my apartment. Someone brought me some pepper spray, which I never hope to use, and I also have a samurai sword at my disposal. Pretty far-fetched there, but hey, whatever makes you feel better, right? It makes me so mad at myself to admit that I'm still really scared of this guy, especially upon recently learning that he has military training. More recently, he was spotted just sitting outside of my work at around 8 p.m., well after closing time. When he was noticed, he just tried to casually disappear into the night air. The guy seems to go out of his way to creep people out, and yet seems to have no idea why no one wants him around. I'm happy to report that I see less of him these days since I park inside, but he does make random stops inside my work to get an odd assortment of items. I've been instructed to go hide in the back until he leaves, which sometimes takes forever, since he seems to stall now and wait for me to come out until he's exhausted of all of his conversation options. Has anyone dealt with anything similar to this? I'd love to hear what you guys have to say or think about this situation. This is less of a creepy one-person encounter, and more a whole community creeped out by one man. The neighbor in question is somewhat famous for his lawn, an impossibly thick green landscape that he had tended by a company. I've vaguely been aware of him losing it on the landscapers, screaming at them outside. Enough that I knew he had a temper. The first real red flag that he might be legit crazy came last summer. He asked a teenage boy in the neighborhood to check in on the house once a day and make sure all the doors and windows were secured and water their flowers. The day they left, though, he left a crazy list saying the kid had to be there multiple times a day, turning off and on different sets of lights at specific times, and leaving weird chores for him. Also, the kid was not allowed to walk on the lawn and had to remove his dirty shoes before walking on the concrete sidewalk. He was never to enter the house, but was to turn off and on the lights from the doorway by means of a stick with a loop on it. Also, he was not allowed to use the garden hose to water the lawn, and had to instead use a teeny tiny watering can. The letter implied that my neighbor would have the kid under surveillance and would have pictures if he failed to comply. Basically, the kid's parents called him and said that they weren't comfortable with the situation anymore, and while they would keep an eye on the house, the deal was off. They argued over the phone. When my neighbor got back from vacation, it was early morning, and he immediately went to their house, woke them, and tried to pick a fight with them. One of the other neighbors is a retired C, and came out to see what was going on, and tried to settle the issue. Crazy neighbor said that he would let it rest if he was allowed to bare butt spank the kid. He flipped out when they told him heck no. Sometime after this, another neighbor was at the grocery store when he was cornered by Crazy Neighbor. Crazy Neighbor apparently just talked at him in rapid fire for a half an hour. Among other things, he started saying how wives shouldn't have friends. After this, everyone started talking about how you don't see his wife anywhere. Occasionally, she will be out watering flowers, but while her husband is seen out, she isn't. Considering that you used to be a social butterfly, this is weird. During the winter, everyone found pamphlets in their mailbox from the landscaper he uses, along with a note saying that it was mandatory to now use this landscaper in our area, and failure to comply will result in being sued. We are private, single-family homes with no HOA, so this is patently untrue. During the winter, someone saw his wife, and her arm was in a sling and she had a black eye. When they went to ask her about it, he wouldn't let her speak and said that she had slid on ice. Since then, there have been a few attempts to talk to her alone, and all have failed. They've gone so far as to get their church involved and to call a welfare check by the cops when he was out of the house. But if she was being assaulted, she has been refusing help. Snow was bad this year, and he blew a fit about the snowplows piling snow on his property. So he scattered screws on the roadway outside before they came by one morning. Then someone in the neighborhood got a puppy. It's quiet and has a fenced-in backyard. Its owners wake up in the middle of the night to the doorbell ringing. When they come out, Crazy Neighbor is standing on the road at the edge of the property. He tells them that the first time the dog gets out, they won't have a dog anymore, and pulls out a gun and waves it around before pointing it towards the backyard and saying bang. Obviously, they go back inside and call the cops. When confronted, Crazy Neighbor claims that he was out for a walk, thought they were awake and stopped by. He says he didn't get the gun out, but it had been on his belt and that he didn't mean his statement as a threat. He got some sort of citation from the police. Come spring, he has taken to sitting outside and writing something every time someone walks or drives by. We don't know what, but I have taken to driving differently home to avoid going by him. Most recently, someone put up a swing in the backyard. They came home from work to find tire tracks through their backyard, and the swing set run over and crushed. No one saw anything, but his massive truck happens to have the same kind of tires as the tread marks left behind. The retired cop has taken to compiling statements from everyone and keeping records, because we think that this is going to end badly. Edit. To anyone wondering, I have 2 more updates in other posts. Check my post history. But for a little bit of a short version, he's since done some nighttime creepy crawling, threatened to shoot children, and he got to do a little jail time. To keep it brief, when I was 17, my family and I lived in a rural town in Australia. We moved into a relatively isolated neighborhood, but about 50 to 100 meters next door lived a single old lady. When moving in, she seemed nice enough and introduced herself, etc. Always seemed a tad nosy and asking a lot of questions, but I put it down as what lonely people do. She seemed sweet, or so I thought. One day, on school holidays, I was home alone and making a sandwich in the kitchen. I look out the window over to her property and through her bedroom window. I thought I saw her figure in the distance, but it was hard to tell. For some creepy reason, I got my binoculars. I was bored, okay? I looked over, focused them, and my heart sank into my chest. Mouth dried and legs shook with shock as I realized that she was staring directly at me. After a few seconds, she made a massive grin on her face. I shut the blinds, told my parents, but they played it off, saying that I must have not looked properly. But that's not even the creepy part. The night before we were set to move, my father was in the Air Force. I finished playing around on my PC before going to bed. I awoke to rustling sounds outside. I got freaked out when I realized that it wasn't merely creaking sounds in the house. With frozen courage, I peeked out the blinds ever so slightly. And bam! I made eye contact with the old lady directly out my window. My body froze and she started quietly laughing, not moving her gaze at all. I shut the blinds, panicked, and shouted for my parents. The 3 of us searched outside, but nothing. My dad confronted her, and she acted like the phony, sweet old lady with dementia again. Thank God we moved the next day. As we packed, something in the back of my mind told me that she was watching from afar. Still sends shivers down my spine. I still have paranoia, trouble sleeping at night, and bad dreams. I try to justify it as mental illness or dementia, but it still scares me even though I'm 22. I just imagine one day the same lady out my window, even though I've moved across the country. I just want to say how much I appreciate this subreddit, being a safe place to share these stories. I've shared a few stories in a previous post, but reading what others have shared has jogged my memory, and also made me realize how messed up some of these situations really were. A year ago, my apartment complex decided that they wanted to renovate my unit, so I had to move out at the end of my lease. I live in Denver, and rent is pretty ridiculous here, so I started worrying about finding something affordable in my neighborhood, which I love. I posted on the Nextdoor app to see if anyone in my neighborhood knew of any affordable rentals in the area. I immediately got a message from someone named Joe, who said that one of the condos in his complex was going to be up for rent soon, and he knew the owner. He offered to get me in touch with the owner. I asked if he could send me pictures of the unit, and he asked if he could text me some pictures of his neighbor took, because the chat function on the app is really slow. I now feel stupid for doing this, but I gave him my phone number. I kid you not, I received a phone call from an unknown number within seconds. I don't normally answer calls from unknown numbers, but I was expecting a call from a number that wasn't saved in my phone, so I answered it. I was completely bewildered when the person said, "Hi, it's Joe. How's your day going?" Huh? It took me by surprise, and I didn't know what to say. He started to shoot the crap on the phone, talking about how he works nights, and how tired he is, and how he takes care of his daughter while his girlfriend works during the day. I finally interrupted and said, "So, about the condo?" He pretty much disregarded that and said, "I don't think my girlfriend would appreciate me talking to you, but I don't have to tell her, right?" I said I have to go and immediately hung up the phone. As soon as I did, he started texting me. It was really bizarre and alarming to me. I blocked his number, and moments later he found me on Facebook and sent me a friend request. I'm 32 years old, but it was so disturbing to me that I called my parents to tell them about it, and how unnerved it made me. And the worst part is that on Nextdoor, even if your exact address isn't listed, your complex is. I was pretty certain that I didn't have my address visible in my profile, but I checked and sure enough, my address and unit number were public. Unable to contact me any other way, he started messaging me again on Nextdoor, asking if I wanted to go on a walk with him. You can't block or report people on the app, so I deleted it. One night, a month or so later, I had a knock at my door at around 10 o'clock on a weeknight. I looked out my peephole, but couldn't get a good enough look at the person. He had his head down slightly. Either way, I don't answer the door for anyone I'm not expecting, especially not a random guy at 10 o'clock at night. Feeling panicked, I called my neighbor across the hall. She's an older woman and we look out for each other since we both live alone. I asked her if it looked like he was a delivery guy at the wrong door. She opened her door to get a good look at the guy, and that spooked him because he literally ran away. I have no idea if this was the next door guy or not, but my gut tells me that it was. This was a big wake-up call. I always felt like I practiced good online safety, but I didn't even know that my address was visible on Nextdoor. I'll never be casual or lazy about privacy settings like that again. For a bit of context, I grew up in the middle of farmland in a large 1800s Victorian home. Given its history, there has always been several shacks and barns that once belonged to the builder of this house. There's a highway that sees maybe 3 cars on it during the night, and directly across from said highway, about 200 feet inward of a cornfield, is a shack that I have always found creepy. As kids, myself and my friends would dare each other to go inside and look, which always ended up with us going as a team. Nothing scary was ever found. Maybe a few broken glasses, metal piles, and miscellaneous items. There was no electricity or any sort of utility that made it homely. Years go by, and the existence of the shack becomes a part of my daily life. However, one particular night as I was watching TV, I noticed a light going off and on outside of my window. After getting startled, I dismissed it as passing cars, simply more frequent than they typically are. An hour passes. It's nearing midnight and the light stays on. This time, I know for sure it's coming from outside. My family was asleep, but being my pansy 16-year-old self, I needed confirmation. Too bad for me, no one wants to go check it out. So I go alone. I grabbed my pocket knife and a flashlight, the best I could think of with my shaken thoughts, and I take off into the night. As I neared the highway, the light turns off, almost making me choke on air, but I had to figure out what the heck was going on. I make it to the entrance of the shack, which has no door, and slowly begin to enter, my flashlight scanning the room for any sign of life. What happened next, I'll never forget. 5 feet away from me, there's an old tattered recliner, facing away, that my father had tossed in there for future disposal. I shine my light on it, because I knew I'd seen it rock ever so slightly. As I did that, a man stands up from the recliner, saying absolutely nothing. All I could tell was that he was middle-aged and wearing a jacket of sorts. Before I could process what was happening, I was already sprinting across the road and praying that he wasn't behind me. It felt like years before I could make it to my door, but as I'm about to make it into safety, I decide to look back. He was standing in the road completely still, no words whatsoever. It's been 7 years since then. The shack still stands. The recliner remains in place. My dad never believed me. I wish someone could share the dread that I had when I realized the recliner was facing a window, which was directed straight at my house. To the guy that was staying in that shack, please, let's not meet again. Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them. I also hope that you enjoy the extra rain at the end. Get a good night's sleep, everyone, and I'll read to you in the next video. Bye-bye now.